Hello, and welcome back to our Books of the Bible study. We've been looking at the book of Deuteronomy for about 4 weeks now, and there's a particular verse of the Bible I promised to explain before we were done, and that is Deuteronomy 34:7. And it reads this way, and I'm going to read from the NIV here. It says, Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. And that's from the New International Version. So Moses was 120, but his eyes weren't weak or his strength wasn't gone. I mean, isn't that why we die? Because our strength is gone? And don't our eyes grow weak as we age? I mean, what is the author trying to say? And when we try to understand particularly difficult passages, a lot of times they're kind of weird passages or passages that we just don't get. We look in other translations and see what other translators have tried to do to express the same ideas. See if it becomes a little more clear. So let me read a few more translations to you. Now, this next one is the New Living Translation. It says, yet his eyesight was clear, and he was as strong as ever. The King James Bible says, his eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated. Natural force abated. I want someone to say that about me one day. The Holman Christian Standard says, his eyes were not weak, and his vitality had not left him. The International Standard Version says that his eyesight wasn't impaired and he was still vigorous and strong. The Net Bible says his eye was not dull, nor had his vitality departed. The New American Standard from 1977 says his eye was not dim, nor had his vigor abated. The American Standard Version says that his eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated. And the Brenton Septuagint translation says that his eyes were not dimmed, nor were his natural powers destroyed. I mean, all of them agree that his eyes were not dimmed. We got that part. But then they all go on to talk about natural force, his natural powers, his vitality, his vigor. I mean, that reminds me of Frank Costanza. I feel vigorous. What are they all trying to say? What's going on? What about the last bit? I mean, the Young's Literal Translation of the Bible says this, his eye hath not become dim, nor hath his moisture fled. His moisture hadn't fled? We're talking life force and moisture and vigor and vitality. What's going on there? Well, the Hebrew word that they're all trying to translate is leach. It means fresh or moist. So that the Young's translation wasn't that far off. Freshness? Moisture? What is the author trying to tell us? What is he trying to say? Now, this is a euphemism, an ancient euphemism that we see other places that I'm going to dance around as much as our translators do, because this is a family show, and I want to keep my job. It's a euphemism for a man's potency, his virility. He's still vigorous and going strong. Think in the lines of Viagra, except they're saying you don't need the little blue pill. And this, let's be honest, why are we hearing this about Moses? I don't want to hear this about any of my friends, let alone biblical heroes. But why does the author want you to know that Moses is still going strong and can still make babies? It's getting to something here, but to understand this, we have to go back a bit in the Bible. Now, Genesis to Deuteronomy are what we call the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Bible, Penta, 5. And these 5 books all go together. They're telling a story. And in fact, the number one personality besides God in these 5 books is Moses. And he's prominent in all but one of them. And in Genesis, he's not there, but as soon as Exodus hits, boom, he's on the scene and dies here at the very tail end of Deuteronomy. And that's what we're talking about. And in Genesis, before Moses, we see a man called by God to do something new. The man's name was Abraham, sometimes referred to as Father Abraham. We'll talk about that in just a moment. God called him to do something new in the world. God called him to begin the process of reuniting heaven and earth. He was going to be God's partner in reuniting heaven and earth. We see in Genesis 1 and 2, the very beginning of the Bible, a deep personal relationship between God and humanity, heaven and earth coexisting, God's presence alive and well amongst people on earth. But in Genesis 3, we see sin erupt and heaven and earth are ripped apart. That presence is lost. And then we see some human fumbling attempts trying to reunite heaven and earth, but for their own purposes, their own reasons. We see that with the Tower of Babel. But God says, this is my job. And God takes the initiative to bring his heavenly presence back personally into people's lives. And we see that this begins with Abraham, that Father Abraham. Father Abraham had many sons, and many sons. You know that song. My third grade teacher taught me that song. I just transferred from a public school to a Christian school, and every morning my teacher made us sing that as we exercised. Some weird akimbo dance, and I thought she was talking about Abraham Lincoln. But no, talking about Abraham from Genesis chapter 12. And what we read is that God promises Abraham that everyone in the world will be blessed through you. And he's talking not just about Abraham himself is going to be a blessing, but his descendants. And God says, look at the stars. You're going to have that many descendants. Look at the sand. Your descendants are going to be so many that you can't count them, just like the sand, just like the stars. And it's going to be a new kind of people, a people who will be a blessing to the whole world, a global vision for heaven and earth reuniting through individuals' lives. Generations of descendants that will be a heavenly presence here on earth. Now, let me ask you, how do you have descendants? You got to have kids, right? But you have to have kids who have more kids. And what do you do to have kids who have kids? That brings us back to me trying to keep my job. But we're talking about freshness and moisture, feeling vigorous, You get the picture. If you don't understand by now, just pause a moment, go talk to a friend. I'm sure they'll help you out. They'll help explain it. If you get it, you got it, okay? So this brings us back to Deuteronomy. All right, Deuteronomy 34. And what we're reading here about Moses are euphemisms. The writer is trying to say about his vision. He had a vision for what God is doing, and it had not grown dim. God's mission remained his focus. He had a vision for keeping things moving forward, God's goal in mind, that reunion of heaven and earth. Because keep in mind, Moses is out there in the wilderness with a relatively small group of people compared to the global presence of humanity. And so Moses' job as a partner with God is to bring these people into that global reality of that heaven and earth coming together. That means things have to keep moving forward, right? You can't just stop and say, there's enough of us out here in the wilderness, let's call it good. No, that means you have to keep having a vision for moving forward. And that's what Moses had. He had a vision for what God was doing, and it had not grown dim. And the writer's then talking about this natural force, these natural powers, that he's still able to have babies with vitality and vigor. It had not abated. What he's saying is that Moses was still participating in the creation of a new generation of the heavenly presence. New generations. Moses was still actively involved in making more people who could take the world in a heavenly direction. I think you kind of know what I'm talking about. How many people do you know that as they age, they drop out of active church life? I've done my time, I've heard. I've done my time. I'm done. It's someone else's turn. Someone else needs to do the work, not me. I've seen this time and time again, people trade in that godly mission for personal comfort. That godly vision has grown dim, and it grows dimmer as they age. Now, this isn't everyone, but I've seen this time and time again. Vitality diminishes in some people's lives. They're no longer potent in ministry for God. They're satisfied just with their friends, their church as it is. They don't see that anything needs to go further. This is enough. We're good enough. They're no longer involved in creating new generations of this godly presence. Too many are going to the grave with a vision dimmed and vitality gone. My prayer is that as we read this tail end of the book of Deuteronomy, that Moses can be our example of a vision that is bright and a vigorous passion for creating the next generation of believers beyond ourselves. To God be the glory in this passage. May we understand it and may it inspire us. Talk to you later.